is utter nonsense if we understand that racism must be connected in order to actually be racism to negative, pervasive, persistent negative consequences to groups and members of those groups. So my feelings hurt now. Even something bad happens to me now. If it happens and white folks suffer major political and economic consequences, but I don't see that happening anywhere, right? White folks can have a huge riot and burn down buildings and overturn cars because the hockey game didn't go their way, or the hockey game did go their way. And we go, yeah, man, those people are big hockey fans. It does not work so well for people of color. That is racism. So, here's the folk theory. The folk theory is this is what race is, this is what racism is. Now, that folk theory, I'm going to turn this, there we go, that's better. The folk theory contains within it, or informs, or is informed by, linguistic ideologies. So the way that language, the everyday language of white racism operates within this idea of language ideology or linguistic ideologies. And again, I'm running very quickly through this because I want to have time for questions at the end, so we'll take some questions at the end. But we can talk about language ideologies or linguistic ideologies as identifiable anytime you find some kind of practice which has iconicity and erasure and fractal recursivity. I can't even type either. I must apologize for the fact that that's not good, and I must fix that. And anyway, for people who know this one, okay, where did I go? Enable editing. Yes, I can edit my own bloody file. Well, it doesn't, the spell check never likes recursivity anyway, so you've probably fought me on the current slide. Okay, so iconicity, erasure, fractal recursivity are cases when, as we are talking about things or using language, we make iconic connections. For example, a connection between a particular way of speaking and a particular sort of person. That's iconicity. So if we connect African American vernacular English with people with African Americans, that's an iconic connection. To say there's some sort of natural link and resemblance that permits us to talk about the language and the people as if the language and the people share substance, share qualities with one another. And as we'll see, that poster, the post to, what, Wikipedia? No, it wasn't Wikipedia. But the post that was on my poster.
Urban Dictionary?
Urban Dictionary. The Urban Dictionary definition exhibits this. It very much talks about, for example, the laziness of language, which seems to draw an iconic link to the perceived qualities of the people associated with the language. So that's iconicity. Erasure, but iconicity works other ways too, right? Iconicity means that speaking standard white middle-class American English is iconically connected to being educated, being professional, being successful in ways. So that you can actually cause people to have difficulty understanding someone if you give them the impression that that person might not speak standard white middle-class American English. There was a research project that was conducted it was a psychology experiment, so it was one of those things where if you were taking Psych 101, everybody had to go do the experiment, right? And what you did is you sat in the room and they played a 15-minute lecture. Now they had a woman record the lectures, and she recorded one humanities lecture and one science lecture. And she was a person who spoke upper Midwest white middle-class American English. And she recorded both the humanities lecture and the science lecture in white, upper middle class American English. And then she went away. And then they took 2 pictures. They took a picture of another white woman, not even the woman who had talked, but a white woman. And they took a picture of an Asian woman standing in front of a classroom at a podium and basically as close as they could get to the same posture, roughly the same clothes, same expression on their face. And then they showed the picture up on the screen and they played the tape for you. You're the Psych 101 students and you're taking things. So you listen to the tape and then they gave you a survey that said, okay, did the person who was giving the lecture have an accent among other things? And a statistically significant number of people, when they were looking at an Asian person listening to the tape, heard an accent. And when they were looking at a white person and listening to the same tape, didn't hear an accent. Which there was no accent, it was good newsreader, Midwest, upper Midwest, white, middle class American. So that was interesting. And then they gave them a content test. So they gave them a content test about the humanities topic. If you were in the group that got the humanities subject, you had to take a content test about whatever it was. I don't know what Queequeg is doing in Moby Dick. I don't know. No. And if you were doing the science test, then you had to take a science. Or science class. Listen to science lecture, you had to take a science test based on the content. Humanities, there was a small difference. If you were looking at an Asian woman, you did slightly less well on the content than if you had been looking at a white woman and listened to the same tape. If it was the science one, you did significantly less well if you were looking at an Asian face while listening to a science lecture than you did if you were looking at a white face. Now, I can show you reams of both student and student parent complaints to big research universities. My child had a teaching assistant in chemistry who was Asian and they couldn't understand a word that person said. You need to make sure the teaching assistants speak English. In the classroom, I'm paying good money for tuition at the University of Washington or at University of Wisconsin-Madison or any of the many other universities, and my kid was done in by your Asian teaching assistant. And universities have turned to this and said, okay, we've got to give really good English language classes to our international teaching assistants. We need to get their English better. But what this research indicates is it's not a matter of how well somebody speaks English. It's a matter of what the perception in the head of the recipient is, and it's not a matter of their intention. I don't think that the students who are taking the content test were thinking, I really have to be sure to do badly on this test because, right? It wasn't intentional. Racism really isn't in the level of intention. The folk theory says it's about our intention, it's about our conscious choice. But the reality of it is that the structural racism in our environment shapes even our capacity to understand what somebody is saying. Which doesn't mean we're stuck there, right? Implicit association test had a really interesting experience very early on. One of the grad students at Harvard who was working on the team would give himself the test every day, because you can take this test as often as you want. It doesn't matter, you can't prepare for it, you're going to just, you'll have the same results. And he took the test every day, and every day he would think, my implicit racism is still higher. You know, I want it to be 0, you know, it's not. So take the test, take the test. And one day he took the test, and implicit racism was lower. He was like, okay, what did I do? What did I do? And he had been watching the Olympics, and he had been watching people of color do excellent things for several hours. And it changed the shape of the stuff. So that's kind of interesting. Now, erasure and fractal recursivity, I think I will get back to because I have places I need to go. The implicit linguistic ideologies that are relevant to linguistic racism are a couple of them. And these are linguistic ideologies which are not confined to linguistic racism. They're linguistic ideologies shared by Americans as part of our community of practice. One of them is personalism, or a personalist ideology. And this linguistic ideology argues that the most important part of linguistic meaning comes from the beliefs and intentions of the speaker. So it connects very nicely to the American folk theory of racism, which says that racism is mostly about intention and belief and practice. There's this personalist idea about language that says language, really meaning of language has to do with what you intended. Not with what the recipient heard, but with what you intended. And that's a personalist language ideology. Doesn't mean that I don't necessarily, it's not like, oh, that's a rule I must follow. But it's a fundamental structure of meaning. It's the common sense well done. To get out of it, I have to think about it. If I don't think about critically what's going on, I fall into the well done. I have to critically get out of the well done. And the implication, right, is that a well-meaning person cannot really say racist things unintentionally. That it should not be possible to accidentally, unintentionally, and implicitly. And it causes people to reject the idea. When I teach Jane Hill's argument about mock Spanish, I inevitably have students who reject it absolutely, vigorously. That cannot be so. And there's the referentialist, implicit linguistic ideology, which is that words have a proper use and must be used properly. And the implication of that for racism is that education can correct the improper use of words. That if you're using the wrong word, what was it? Benedict Cumberbatch was apologizing last week because he used the word, he talked about colored people instead of people of color. And that's predicated on the idea that the fundamental thing that's going on here is getting the words right. And that, from the perspective of linguistic anthropology, is making the argument that the thing that we need to be focusing on fixing is that tip of the iceberg part above the water. Which is not to say that we think, oh yeah, the tip of the iceberg part, that's not a problem, that's not connected at all. But what we're saying is that the thing that is holding that tip up is where you have to find your solutions. Not reshaping the tip of the iceberg, but without reshaping the berg itself, you're never going to get anywhere. It's a cosmetic fix. It's not real. But a referentialist linguistic ideology says that is real. The real is at that level of proper use, and the real at the level of intention. Now, where does this come into mock forms of language? To do that, to talk about mock forms of language, I need to talk about one more Linganth concept. I'm doing almost a quarter of Linganth in one. But to get to the point where you understand Hill's argument, you have to understand indexicality. And indexicality, or deixis, is the aspect of language that makes it most marvelous from my perspective, and it's become an object of great interest to linguistic anthropologists at the level of how meaning operates, since it is the thing that makes all of the creativity of language possible, or the greatest level of creativity, certainly the thing that makes the jokes possible. Because you can have iconic signs where the sign really resembles the thing, and you can create iconic connections between things and signs and hook them together. So you can have a picture of a woman on a bathroom door, and it means woman bathroom door. Women go through this door. And you can have purely symbolic connections. You can have sounds like microorganism, and it means a thing, right? And there's no connection between microorganism and a microorganism. It's just purely a matter of we've decided, or we've decided that you will call this thing a hand, or you will call this thing a mano, or you will call this thing a me, or you will call this thing any number of other possible things. Well, it's in Russian, then I'm talking about the whole thing, right? So I can't even talk about this thing in Russian. But it's just a matter of convention. It's completely symbolic. In between the iconic, which is this tight connection between this thing and this word or sign, and the symbolic, which is entirely conventional, you have the indexical. And the indexical is something where the sign's connection to its meaning has to do with proximity, contiguity, or necessity. So there's some either either it's close to, it's connected to meaningfully, or it's part of a series, or it's necessary to. Smoke being connected to fire as an index, where smoke doesn't look like fire. It's quite different from fire. You can breathe smoke, breathing fire would be a big problem. But the connection between smoke and fire is not a matter of convention with us. It's not, well, my people think smoke is associated with fire. Those other people there, they think smoke is associated with snow. And it's like, no, the connection between these things is a matter of a relationship. And yet, you can disconnect it and reconnect it in useful and interesting ways. One classic example of a deictic is the pronoun in English, where a pronoun, in order to be meaningful, has to connect to something, to somebody, but it doesn't connect to that somebody and stay connected to them. Instead, it shifts. So if I say, I was talking to my friend Kathy, and she asked me how my daughter was, and I said, well, she's doing pretty well, but she said to me, Mom, my English teacher hates me, and I think that she may be right, that she does hate her. And so I told her that I wanted to help her deal with her. And she said, well, I told my English teacher about you, and she said, you tell her that she needs to butt out. So I can put she, and I can put her, and I can put I all over the place, and you can follow me. It doesn't connect. It doesn't connect because I always means me, or her always means my daughter, or she always means my friend. I can, in the course of an utterance, shift that thing around. That's indexicality. We have to have some kind of shared basis. That's the sort of thing that if you're an English language learner, you just sit there with your head hurting, right? Because it's just hard. But if you're an English speaker and you're 6 years old, you can follow it. So that's how indexicality operates. It operates with these understood connections that we don't have any difficulty with, right? If I'm a speaker of Chinese and I'm learning English, I am really struggling. Because if, for example, I were to introduce my husband into the mix, and I'm easily able to do that, I can say, well, I talked to him, and then you know who I'm talking about because there's only one guy in the whole thing. And we all as English speakers know quite clearly that if it's her, it's a girl, and if it's him, it's a guy, and that's a well, duh. We don't think about it, it just is. But if I'm a speaker of Chinese, where that is not a well, duh, where it's never well, duh, that I have to think about the gender of anybody I'm talking about, then I'm struggling to figure out, okay, no, that was male, no, that was a, wait, oh, huh? Help. I don't know what just happened there. So we have to have these structures of meaning, and we have to operate these structures of meaning without thinking about them. They have to be well done. And that's how the mock forms work. So the mock forms that Hill has identified, she begins identifying them by identifying them in cases of Spanish. So she's specifically looking at mock Spanish. And then later expands this, and I'm talking about mock Ebonics at the end here, but I'm going to start out with mock Spanish, which is where Hill begins her analysis. She's got all of these jokes. She's got this coffee mug that says Caca de Toro on it. She has a picture of the coffee mug that says Caca de Toro in the book from her collection of coffee mugs. Yeah, I always say that if she is the sort of person that I can envision having a Caca de Toro stamp for grad student papers. She's just that kind of irreverent and fun person. And then she looked and saw, oh, shoot, I am actually maintaining the structural racism of my community of practice with these jokes. And she figures this out by analyzing how the jokes work. How do these things operate? What is the indexicality that is required for them to work? And she found several different ways in which these mock Spanish forms work. So you've got semantic derogation. The example of this that I am giving today being numero 2o. Semantic derogation is a mock form which clearly indexes the idea that there is no actual grammar that belongs to that language. All you gotta do is add an O to the end of it, and it becomes a Spanish word. Skippy John Jones in the children's book does a lot of this, unfortunately. And it's painful. It wasn't when I read Skippy John Jones to my daughter, who is now 16, this was well before I read Jane Hill, before Jane Hill was getting rid of her coffee mugs. It was cute. And then you look at it again after you've looked at this and you say, oh, look at that. What I am saying when I say this is one, oh, look how cool and hip and happening I am. And also, here is a language which is connected iconically to a particular group of people. And those people of color. And it isn't a real language like English, it's kind of this fake language. The process of doing that, of denying people their own language, is one that we have engaged in as white folk for a long time. It happened in the Comora Islands, where my mentor Harriet Ottenheimer worked, that the French colonial officers told the people in the Comoras that they didn't really have a language. You know, so that when Harriet went there as a linguistic anthropologist in the 60s and started writing down their grammar rules and their phonological rules, they were like, whoa, we've got rules? Because the tricky thing about these ideological things is that they can become hegemonic. And when an ideology becomes hegemonic, in a Gramscian sense, that means that this well-duh understanding is something that people accept as well-duh. Not just when they are on the top in the dominant group where the well-duh serves me very nicely, my language is better than yours, well done. But if the folks who are not dominant accept also this powerful ideological structure that says, my language is better than your language. And I spend a lot of my time in this horribly ambivalent position, since I am using my language right now. And while I am using my dialect of American English, which is the dialect my parents spoke, and the dialect that is privileged, as I am using it, I am reinforcing in your heads, in that implicit association test way, the idea that this is a better form of language. And I can't not do that. In order to talk to you, especially if I want you to listen to me and hear what I'm saying, I need to use the tool, and using the tool means you're going to have that implicit association built in your head. I'm not sure how to get past that except by telling you that. Look at me, I'm doing this. See the little man behind the curtain. Still getting you home, but it's a little man behind a curtain. So numero 2, your language, that language, those folks' language hasn't really got a grammar like mine. We see it, I mean, you even rip the rules away, right? You say, no problemo in mock Spanish. No problema is the correct Spanish. But you don't say that in mock Spanish, because what you say in mock Spanish is, oh, and it becomes a thing, right? Euphemisms. Cojones is one of the ones. Madeleine Albright used the word, Secretary of State, used the word cojones. Hillary Clinton, somehow our female secretaries of state, Condoleezza Rice did this too. This party is unimportant here. Race, not necessarily a thing. People use the word cojones in public spaces in which they would never, ever say testicles or balls. They just wouldn't. Because it would be, public speech to the United Nations or some international body. Educated women in business suits who want to impress people with how tough they are will use a foul word in public. But it's in Spanish, and that's the language of foul words, right? That's the language for dirty things, which again is associated with the people iconically who speak the language. You couldn't use the French word, whatever it might be. I don't have any idea. What is the French word, Jordan? No, never mind. I didn't practice for that. It's like, you don't necessarily know, and you don't want to say it out loud anyway. But you couldn't do that, or, it doesn't work, right? It doesn't work. Hasta la vista, baby, Arnold Schwarzenegger said. Ronald Reagan later said. They were saying, see you later, right? But they were saying it as a threat. Hasta la vista, baby, means I'm going to kill you. Au revoir, baby. Auf Wiedersehen, baby. Right? Doesn't work. But my well duh, I'm watching the movie, I'm like, ha, yeah, I get that. Because I have in my head a structure of implicit associations that I don't have any control of. That is shaped by all of us, languaging together, that connects that language with it's okay in that language to use it for bad things. Then there's bold mispronunciation. Feliz Navidad on a Christmas card. There's interesting Saturday Night Live sketch that Hill writes about, and it's impossible to get the video. If you could get the video, so many linguistic anthropologists will be happy and probably buy it from you. Which, I just lost, the fellow who plays the presidential candidate in the West Wing, Jimmy Smits. Jimmy Smits is the guest, and all of the Anglo people in the sketch are insisting on producing full-blown trills, so they say burrito and things like that. And he's using regular American pronunciation of Spanish language borrowings and of his own name and his character's name and things like that. And they're all doing this insistence on correct pronunciation that is a sort of appropriation of the language. It's this idea that I can really look cool by messing around with your language, by making your language do things you might not like. But I'm going to look so funny doing it because yours is a language that I can do that with, which again indexes the folks associated with the language in a way that Hill calls dual indexicality. So what she argues is that you've got all of these forms, mock forms, directly index positive qualities about the speaker. So when I use them as a white middle-class person, I am using them to reflect upon myself, my hipness and coolness, and I am aware of it. I'm using it to be fun, or to be fierce, in the case of cojones. I'm using it because I'm, especially, it seems to be women in these positions, and I think it's probably women because they want to put on this very tough stance. And so I'm going to use bad words, but not bad English words. Only bad words in the bad word language. So it directly indexes these positive qualities of the speaker while simultaneously relying on the, why did I do that? I can't type that without negative.